Hello and welcome to the fifth and final raid guide for this raid tier. This time, we're tackling Pallas Athena on the second half of the 12th circle of Anabaseios. Before we begin, there's a couple things I wanted to get out of the way. Pallas Athena is considered a wall boss, meaning positionals are automatically considered correct. Also, we will need clock positions, light parties, and finally, we use horizontal roll lineups for a later mechanic. For that, we have the DPS as the south line and the supports for a north line. Right, so the encounter is going to begin with Pallas Athena using Ultima. You want to mitigate this pretty heavily, but take note to not use everything, because another massive raid wide is going to be here soon. After Ultima, Palladian Grasp will be a new tank buster that will hit your top aggro with a massive buster that hits an entire half of the arena. It's worth noting that this is not relative to where the tank is standing. The snapshot will check if the tank is on the east or west side of the arena. So, theoretically, the tank could stand right next to the party as long as they are on the west portion of the arena. You can handle this as a tank swap if you choose, as there's 2 hits, but I recommend using a tank invuln here. Next, a massive raid-wide called Gaiaochos will then happen. And as this happens, she will shrink the platform to just a small playable circle on the northern side of the platform. Once you're inside the small circle platform, I recommend that everyone stacks very tight in the center, as she will then use Summon Darkness. When using Summon Darkness, she will summon adds around the arena that will do line cleaves in whichever direction they're facing. To solve, the safe spots will either be on east and west, north and south, or northwest, southeast, and southwest, northeast. So you're basically going to a cardinal or an inner cardinal here. At the same time, DPS will be tethered to supports. It's important to note that if people run away too early, it will fail the tether mechanic. So, wait center, and once people are tethered together, you'll see a debuff on your bar marked at 20 seconds. At this point, the DPS and supports will then split off, running opposite to one another. For this, we use a priority system, having supports biased to north and DPS biased to south. In the event it's east and west, we have our DPS go west and supports east. So once the laser baits and the tethers have resolved, Pallas Athena will then use Demi Parhelion. Some AoEs will then spawn around the arena, but for now we can ignore those. More importantly, her tentacles will now wrap around the sphere you're encased in. They will either wrap vertically, horizontally, or in a circle. The way the tentacles wrap will tell you how the safe spot will be formed. So, naturally, if the tentacles are horizontal, the safe spot's going to be horizontal. Likewise for the vertical and circle patterns. I'm going to include all 3 variants of this so that way you can see it. Athena will then use Geocentrisim, which will put a spread marker on every player, as well as snapshot all of the AoEs across the arena. Assuming everyone was stacked in the correct spots, modest damage will occur, and the mechanic will resolve. Finally, once this is done, Athena will use one more Ultima, which will end this phase. Classical Concepts looks overwhelming at first, but we can strip it down bit by bit to make some very straightforward rules. First, there's 4 columns. There will be a hexagon in each column. Your goal is to block the other shapes from moving into the hexagon, which would result in a wipe. Additionally, you and a buddy will receive PlayStation markers on your heads. Whoever you're tethered to, you cannot move away from, or you will both blow up. First, find your column's hexagon. We use the BPOG method from left to right. which is blue or X on the far left, purple or square, which will be second, O or circle is the third, and green or triangle is the far right or fourth. Next, you'll need to determine which shape you will be blocking. 2 additional debuffs will appear on your bar, either an alpha or a beta. Alphas will be blocking the triangles, while betas will be blocking the cubes. An easy way to remember this is that A looks like the top of the triangle, and B for box. A great tip for this mechanic, because there's so much going on, is to only focus on your hexagon. When looking at your hexagon, you'll initially want to see if there is 1 or 2 triangles or boxes close to it. If there's only one shape adjacent to your hexagon that you need to soak, that's your shape. Sometimes there will be 2 shapes adjacent to your hexagon that you could potentially soak. The golden rule for determining which of the 2 is yours is checking both shapes and checking if someone else's hexagon is adjacent to one of them. Every single time, one of those will be eliminated using this rule. Your goal is to soak the shape that is touching no other hexagons, assuming there were 2 initially available. I've included some clips showing how this is done, as well as a diagram. After the shapes are resolved, Pallas Athena will start casting Palladian Ray. Another thing worth mentioning, though, is that all of the shapes will also detonate in small circle AoEs. There are safe spots between all of the shapes that you can wait in before baiting the Palladian Rays. Palladian Rays will spawn 2 different beacons, one on west and one on east. They will target the 4 closest players and leave a persisting AoE after the initial spread damage. They do modest damage, but it's important to note that you cannot remain within the ray. You have to move after you initially bait it. We bait ours on the top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right sides of the beacons. Once the rays are fully resolved, Pallas Athena will then follow up with another Ultima raid-wide, as well as a unique tank buster called Crush Helm. This time, the top 2 players with Enmity will be focused down with 5 blasts, applying a cleansable debuff stacking up to 4 times, followed by a final hit that will kill the target if their stacks are not cleansed. For this, your healers will need to use Asuna on your tanks. If they don't use Asuna, then it's lethal. I recommend not using a tank invuln, as this Crush Helm will come back later in the fight, and it's advantageous to save 1 invuln for that one instead, since this one's a bit earlier on and has less stakes involved. The next mechanic, and the primary mechanic of this fight, is called Caloric Theory 1. We used a strat called the Papan strat, so I take no credit for any of these strategies, and a big thank you for the toolbox on week 1, as it helped us get our week 1 clear last minute on a Monday. Also, if I butchered the name, I apologize. I'm also going to include the toolbox in the description that we used, as well as the paste bin, so that way you guys have access to everything and all credits where credits are due. For this mechanic, we'll have 2 DPS and 2 supports. Start on the letter markers A, B, C, and D. During the cast bar of Caloric Theory, 2 beacons will then spawn at random. If they don't spawn on B or D, you'll need to make sure that they swap out whoever was standing there, so that way you do have a marker on B and D. The 2 beacons should also be on the inner side of the marker, as they'll be needed for when the stack goes off. Everyone else can collapse to mid, other than the people who are waiting on A and C, resulting in 1 person on each letter marker and 4 people in mid. At this point, all 4 players that did not have a beacon and are not on a marker should go stand in the middle between all 4 markers. Caloric Theory will snapshot, and the mechanic will begin. Our objective is to have a fire and an arrow on each marker. To accomplish this, the 4 players that are stacked on top of one another will need to pair up with the players on the markers. You need a priority system to make sure you know who's going where. So our main objective is to have a pair on each letter marker with a fire and arrow stack. Any additional movement on this phase will result in a wipe, so your only movement that you do has to be correct. To achieve this, we'll have only 2 people move from the center at once, and once they're done moving, the next 2 will move. DPS will look at A, clockwise, scanning for their eligible safe spot. Supports will look at D, counterclockwise, checking for their eligible safe spot. An important thing is that there will need to be 1 flexor for both DPS and supports. In the event that a beacon player had to be removed from their spot and someone taking their place, your flexor will now be second in priority. If the beacon player did not have to move, the flexor will be first in priority. At this stage, with everyone in their pairs, the pair soaks will then detonate, signifying that it is now okay for the arrow players to move away from the rest of the party. It's important to note that the arrow players cannot move too much, or they will detonate and explode, wiping the party. I've provided a few examples of me resolving this mechanic with every variation. The arrow players will need to move north if they're already north. The east arrow player will continue eastward. The west arrow player will go west, and the south arrow will go south. The result will be 4 fire players still in center, with 2 of them having beacons. Their objective is to meet on Bravo and Delta once more on the inner side of the marker for a pair stack. The only thing to note here is that the 2 beacons cannot stack together, so the 2 players without beacons will pair up with a beacon. When this is all over and done with, all of the arrows and fires will resolve, and the mechanic will end. After Caloric 1, we'll have Ekpyrosis. Ekpyrosis will always have proximity marker AoEs in the center of the arena. Where you flee to, however, is one of 2 patterns. At the same time, there will be exaflares on either east and west, or north and south. Based on wherever the flares are going, is where your party will go. For example, if it's east and west exaflares, we have it so Light Party 1 will go west, and Light Party 2 will go east. In the event the flares are spawning north and south, we have our tanks and melees go north for damage uptime, and the ranged DPS and healers go south. After a short while, the proximity AoEs will go off, dealing massive damage. At the same time, the exaflares will detonate and begin moving across the arena. As this happens, people should move into where the exaflares were at previously and get ready for a spread marker that will appear on every player. After the spread markers have hit everyone, all players should then collapse into the lanes where the exaflares originated at, so that way they can move in safely for the next raid wide. The next unique mechanic is called Pangenesis. The cast bar of Pangenesis also serves as a heavy-hitting raid wide, so make sure you mitigate appropriately. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of how all the debuffs work, let me explain the mechanic from simple terms first. What's going to happen is a tower will spawn on east and west that needs to be soaked by 2 players. After that, 2 more towers will spawn on each side for a total of 4 towers. 2 players will need to be in each of these towers. After the second set of towers, a third and final set of towers will spawn on each side, again requiring 2 people in each of them. So, let's go back and talk about all the different debuffs. The first debuff we'll talk about are the dark and light tilts that were in the previous phase. A total of 4 players are going to get these buffs, 2 darks and 2 lights. An important thing to distinguish is that of the two lights, one of them will be long and one of them will be short, signified by the duration of the debuff. The short timer will be one of the people that is going into the initial tower that spawns. For example, if a dark tower spawns on west, the short light will be going to the west tower. The next role that will be soaking the tower will be whoever gets the DNA buff with a 1 on it. We call these the ones. So, the initial towers will be soaked by the ones, as well as the short, light, and dark. We stretch into a conga line before this mechanic begins, so that way the two people that get the 1 debuff can quickly signify if they're going to go on the left tower or the right tower. That accounts for 4 people so far. We have the ones and the short timers in the towers, which leaves us with the final 2 debuffs, where the long timer is going, as well as the nothing timer, the person who doesn't have debuffs. The long timer will be waiting adjacent to the initial tower spawn on the south side, whereas the nothing debuff player will be waiting adjacent to the first tower on the north side. The reason why we have them set up this way is after the initial towers go off, 2 more towers will spawn, and the nothing player will be stacked in the north tower, and the long timer player will be in the south tower. An important thing to note is that based on whichever tower is on east and west, the next sequence of towers will always have the same suit on the south side. So if dark spawns west, the next 2 towers, the southern one will also be dark. If light is on east, then the southern tower will also be light. The reason why this matters is that whenever you soak a tower, you will always go south unless your debuff changes. If your debuff changes, you will go to the northern tower. What this results in is you soaking your initial tower, checking your debuff. Did it change? No? Stay in this direction. Did it change? Yes? Then you change directions. The final detail is that when you're soaking your tower with your partner, you'll need to remain still and mix with your partner, which summons a little blob of goo under you. Failure to mix with your partner will result in a wipe. Meaning, if someone is late to show up to their tower, you have to remain there for a moment to make sure you mix before moving to your next solution. The timing is fairly generous on this, so don't be in a rush. After the towers are resolved, those goos that were spawned by players mixing will then start tethering to nearby players. To resolve this, the 2 players that had nothing during the mechanic will be the ones to soak these AoEs. For our strategy, we had our nothings take the tethers and go to the northwest and northeast corners. I also want to preface saying that this strategy that we're using is not the most optimal as it involves rescue strats, which is not the most efficient tactic regarding healer DPS, but it's what we did as it was the most intuitive at the time. I recommend it for prog's sake, but once you want to start optimizing, I would move past this strat and see if there's a better one available. So, as these tethers go off, massive AoEs will go around the 2 nothing players that soaked them. And at the same time, another cast of Palladian Grasp will be going off. This was the tank buster that hits one side of the arena. To resolve this, we had the tank invuln on the left side of the arena, and rescue the left nothing player that got hit by their AoEs. Once your tank is done with his buster, a second cast of classical concepts is on the way. This time, there'll be a twist. Like before, you'll take massive raid damage and receive a PlayStation marker above your head. Except this time, you'll want to quickly locate your safe spot that you planned on standing in. But don't get too comfortable, as she will then use Panta Ray, which will mirror all of the shapes, flipping them across the entire arena. meaning your initial safe spot will have to be translated over the center of the arena and reflected into a new spot. To make this a lot easier, I'm going to provide a diagram that color codes all of the safe spots. To resolve this, you'll find your initial safe spot as you would on the first classical concepts. Using this diagram, you'll locate your color that you're standing in, and then, using the same diagram, you can see the same color on the opposite side of the diagram reflected. So, after a few seconds of locating your spot, you and your partner will then move over to your new safe spots. The timing here is fairly generous, and you can sprint it while progging, as long as your partner knows that you're sprinting. Another cast of Palladian Ray will then follow suit. This time, the ray will be baited before the shapes explode. So, after you bait your ray, it's imperative that you immediately move away from the shapes. The safe spot you used previously is a little more dangerous this time, because the baits will be on top of the spot between the shapes. So I like to move away from the shapes and get out of the way. Then, after that, another raid-wide Ultima will follow suit, as well as another Crush Helm tank buster. If you saved an invuln earlier, I would recommend using one of your invulns here, so that way it's a little easier on your healers before the next mechanic. Next mechanic is Caloric 2, which I will provide a diagram on how you should split up your team. Having these exact positions will make the mechanic resolve very smoothly. It's important to note that at the start of the mechanic, one player is going to get a red indicator above their head. Whoever that is will need to take their position in the middle of the group, and whoever was in the middle will take their spot. Next, an indicator will spawn over one player, making this mechanic kind of like Hot Potato. After a moment, an AoE will spawn under whoever first gets the AoE. It's important that whoever starts with this mechanic waits for a moment before moving and lets the AoE spawn. The debuff they'll have is called Entropification. Once they have it and the AoE spawns, they will move in a clockwise manner, passing the hot potato to the next person, and then moving to their new safe spot, which will be diagonal from where they passed from. The hot potato will make its way through the entire group until eventually everyone has touched it once. After everyone has moved to their new positions, everyone should remain still, as the arrow spread markers will then go off and deal modest damage to the whole party. As soon as this is all resolved, everyone will want to quickly collapse to the center and get ready for heals, as another Exaflare is going to spawn, as well as proximity markers in the middle of the arena, just like before. There's no difference with this version of the Exaflare mechanic, so it should be solved the exact same way. But it's important to note that you don't want to burn too many mitigations, as two massive raid-wides will be following suit. Once the Exaflares are over and done with, another Ultima is going to happen, which you'll want to mitigate pretty hard. And then finally, another massive raid-wide is coming quickly after, with the second usage of Gaiaochos. On this cast, you'll be transported back into the circular arena that you were in before. Alright, so once you're back in the small circular arena, Pallas Athena will use Summon Darkness once more. She will only summon one ad this time that will spawn on an intercardinal. Always an intercardinal. Meaning, the safe spot will either be northwest and southeast, or northeast and southwest. Next, she'll cast Demi Parhelion like before, which is the AoE indicators followed by the tentacles indicating whether it'll be vertical or horizontal. There can never be the circular pattern in this mechanic. A lot of AoEs are going to spawn, and you're going to want to move, but it's important that you don't move right away. You should only move once the tether debuff is visible on your bar. The debuff starts at 20 seconds. Your objective is to break the tether like before, running to your designated intercard, but also resolving the horizontal or vertical tentacle as soon as your tether is snapped. I cannot stress enough how much easier this mechanic is with Sprint, so I recommend practicing on the very first version of this mechanic with Sprint and breaking your tether. Once you've snapped your tethers and moved into the horizontal or vertical safe spot, it's important to note that there will be spread indicators like before, but that ad waiting on the intercardinal is going to shoot a laser. The laser will snapshot at the same time as Geocentrisim, meaning that if your team wants to run along the horizontal or vertical line, they are going to have to wait for the laser to go off before running. Tanks can survive the laser and receive a damage down. I don't know if other jobs can survive it or not. I wouldn't risk it. The final mechanic of this fight is another round of Summon Darkness. This time, she'll spawn ads all over the arena, but to be honest, you can ignore them. What you want to pay attention to is the tethers that follow. Athena will then tether all 4 DPS or all 4 supports. Those tethers should then be stretched exactly across from where they origin from. These tethers will one-shot the players who they are attached to, unless somebody blocks the tether for them, meaning they'll have to stand in front of you. To resolve this, you can actually dumb it down by using the Focus Target feature. You'll have to check in your keybinds what you have your focus target set to, but what it lets you do is target one of your teammates permanently throughout the fight, and it puts a marker above their head. So what you can do is have a DPS and a support buddy focus target one another at the very beginning of the fight. And by the time you get to this mechanic, you'll see a very huge and hard to miss AoE above their head, making it very easy on where they are. So whoever gets tethered stretches out their tether, and their focus target person will follow them promptly and stay in front of them during the first blast. It's worth noting that there will always be an Ultima cast immediately after the first round of tethers. After the first Ultima, there will be another round of tethers, this time hitting the opposite faction. The DPS or supports should stand in front of them once more, and get ready for another Ultima raid-wide that follows. That Ultima is the final damage in the fight, and no more healing should be done at this point. She will then start going into her hard enrage, which lasts for roughly 20 seconds or so you have quite a while to hit the boss. Assuming you're victorious, the boss and the tier are complete. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. This is my first ever raid tier making guides, and I've learned a lot across the way, and I wanted to thank Victoria for editing all of my videos and everyone else who has been watching them, commenting, saying the things they like, saying the things they didn't like, and I really appreciate all the support and whatnot going forward, and I can't wait to do more and strive to make better guides. I do stream full-time on twitch.tv/AhriEffect, and I hope to see you guys there sometime. Hope you guys get your clears, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.